Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Grant Tinsley. He is an associate professor at Texas Tech University and the owner of Tinsley Consulting LLC. He performs academic research, mentors student researchers, and teaches undergraduate and graduate courses. And he leads a team of researchers at the director of the Energy Balance and Body Composition Laboratory. So, Dr. Tinsley, looking forward to chatting with you, and I appreciate you taking time out of your day today to come on here.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm really looking forward to chatting with you. I know you guys do a ton of great research out there at your lab, so I was really excited to get you on to talk about body composition exactly. But I guess before we dive into the topics, if anybody isn't familiar with you, could you maybe just give a little bit of a brief background on you and maybe how you got into what you do, and that way we'll set the stage for what we're gonna.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess my interest in this space related to fitness and health really started out probably when I was 11 or 12. I'd always done sports, but I hadn't thought a lot about fitness at that time or things related to physique and so on. I had a friend who we were chatting offline here in Kansas City, Missouri, a friend who just was unusually ripped, to be honest, for a junior high kid. And I was talking to him, I'm like, man, how are you so ripped? He's, oh, I do 100 push-ups and 100 sit-ups every night. And he's, oh yeah, this is why I do this. I want to have a six pack and this and that. And it's really interesting. It was the first time I thought about like training for like physique or health, something beyond just like going to my sport practices. I hadn't lifted, was not familiar with this. That was the start of a lifting bug, a lifelong lifting bug. Anyone who does this realizes you're hooked for life once you're hooked. But I began to get interested in this topic just of exercise training. That, of course, led me into an interest in nutrition. I really didn't know what I was doing as a teenager, but I had a high level of interest. When I went off to college, I paired that interest in terms of a hobby with my formal studies. So I always loved science. I started studying physiology at Oklahoma State University, and I earned degrees there in physiology and nutrition. So I was learning a lot about the body, learning about nutrition, and then I was learning from a lot of people in the gym who knew a lot more than me. I had never lifted for sports, and I was interacting with all these people who had been part of large high school athletic programs. They had learned things about lifting. I got some good knowledge in the gym, some bad knowledge in the gym. It was this kind of nice combination of the academic side, the experiential side. After that, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, to be honest, but I loved the human body and I wanted to keep studying. So I went to Colorado State University and got a master's in biomedical sciences. And a lot of that program was cadaver dissection. And this certainly gave me an appreciation for the human body that I didn't have previously, because we spent hundreds of hours with these cadavers dissecting them. I certainly appreciated the muscles in a way I hadn't before. Still, after my master's program, I was a little bit at a crossroads. I know I love school, I know I love science, but I wasn't sure where the career was going to go in this area. But I found the unique PhD program at Baylor University here in Texas that combined the exercise side that I had this passion for with nutrition, which I had studied formally. So I got a PhD there in kinesiology and exercise nutrition. And this is really where I fell in love with research. Previously, I had done some research, but it was all in rodents. It was a lot of benchtop work. So I was pipetting things. It looked like a chemistry lab. It was a chemistry lab. And I didn't have the passion for it. But once I started doing human research, it was really enjoyable because I was conducting the types of studies that people were interested in. So if we were doing a study on fasting, we were recruiting humans, we were putting them through training programs, testing their body, all these things. We're essentially asking a question that a lot of people are interested in. The fact that we're sitting here having a conversation kind of reinforces this, that it's fun to be studying something that is not just for academics. It's really for everyone interested in fitness. So when I finished my PhD at Baylor, I got the job that I have now here at Texas Tech University, and I've now been here 7 years. So I primarily conduct research related to body composition, kind of manipulations and energy balance. So things like fasting, all the way up to overfeeding, and then quite a bit of dietary supplement work as well. And then I do teach some courses as well in the same topics: body composition, sports nutrition, and so on. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background in fitness and on the academic side. To me, it really merges of the passion for this academically, but certainly have the interest in walking the walk and connecting with practitioners and so on. So yeah, again, excited to be talking with you here today.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you sharing all that. And one of the big reasons I wanted to bring you on is because you've done a ton of research around, like you said, body composition type stuff, things that people are, when they get into working out, that's what they're focused on, is the body composition side of things. And so you guys are doing a lot of interesting stuff there. And I know you said you did energy balance stuff too. So again, all really interesting stuff that really helps out with the aesthetic side of things and muscle growth and everything like that. So cool. Appreciate you sharing that. So let's dive into the first topic today. I know you mentioned you did a lot of body composition stuff, research around that. And so what I wanted to talk to you about initially was body composition readers, how to track body composition, just because I get a lot of questions about, not necessarily questions, but people will bring up things about body composition readers, right? And, oh, hey, what's my body fat percentage? And so I wanted to talk about that specifically. And so I guess the first thing to go over is like, what do these typically measure exactly? And then we can go from there in terms of what the differences are and stuff like that. But I guess just to start off, what do some of these measure?
Yeah, so I'll say there are situations where someone might have access to medical grade testing, but in most cases, people might have access to a device that's sort of laying around in their gym or something they purchased from Walmart or Amazon or that a friend has or so on. So there will be exceptions to what I'm going to say. Again, if you are in the unique situation that you have access to a more like a research laboratory or medical facility where you could get a more advanced procedure done, then that's great. We can certainly discuss that if you'd like. But what many people have access to would be something ranging from like a calculator they're using online, where they're just putting in some information about themselves, to something like an at home body fat scale. This would be a really common device that is either available to consumers individually. I'm seeing these increasingly, say, in supplement stores. There'll be a supplement store and they'll have a bioimpedance unit sitting in there so people can just walk in and estimate their body fat. And then some like gyms or fitness centers as well might have something like bioimpedance. Some now also have things like 3D scanners. 3D scanning is also available through some mobile applications. So that'd be another example of something that's available to consumer. So to start answering your question, there are many different devices that will give you metrics like your body fat percentage or your fat-free mass. However, none of them are truly measuring that. So I mentioned cadaver dissection a minute ago. The only way we could truly know, say, your body fat percentage is if you were a corpse, your cadaver, and we chemically or physically dissected you, weighed out everything very precisely, or analyzed it chemically very precisely. Of course, that's not applicable to what we're wanting, which is an assessment in a living human, something we can do repeatedly over time to check. But the reason I mention that is no matter what assessment it is, if this is a medical grade assessment, if this is your at home body fat scale, it's just an estimate. So it's not truly measuring, say, your body fat. It's giving its estimate. And how it does that is it measures something, but then it uses a series of equations to get from what was actually measured by the device to, say, a body fat percentage. So to give a concrete example, let's use the at-home body fat scales. Many individuals have access to something like this or have wondered about something like this. If you step on that scale with kind of those little silver plated electrodes, when you're standing on there, the scale is inserting small, imperceptible electrical currents into your body, and it knows essentially the frequency and intensity of the current it's passing into your body. And then as that travels through all or some of your body, if this is just your feet, it's likely not traveling through all your body, but say it passes into your feet, that current is received at other electrodes. So again, those little silver plates you're standing on. So based on what the device knows it inserted into you and what it receives, it's essentially estimating these properties of your tissue, like how easily does this current travel through your body tissues. From that information under the hood, that information will go into a series of equations that typically are proprietary, meaning we don't know for sure how they were developed, how well the company developed these, and then it will spit out a number like your body fat percentage. So point being, it is measuring something with fairly cheap components, but then it's taking a few jumps to get to what we're actually trying to estimate, which is our body fat percentage. So that's one example for this technology, these at-home body fat scales. That technology would be called bioelectrical impedance analysis. However, each different technology has other things it's measuring. So the 3D scanners, again, these are increasingly accessible. You could do this. There's some apps you can do this just with your phone camera. Those are just looking at the overall shape of your body. And it's say pulling your hip circumference automatically from these pictures, your waist circumference, and so on. It's plugging those into some type of equation that was developed somewhere and giving you a body fat percentage. So point being, these devices, even if they're giving you what appears to be the same metric at the end, they're going about it a very different way. And all of them are involving these kind of jumps from what they actually measured to what you want to know.
Yeah, it sounds like with a lot of things that we have access to, it's an estimate to start. And then from there, there's different formulations that they have or equations to get you there. And then, so it's like that there's an estimate from there and then even more of an estimate essentially with all these.
Yeah, absolutely. So even without talking about numbers or like percent errors or anything like that, it should already give you, any individual, a little bit of a sense of skepticism. If you're seeing something from this device, a strange result, you shouldn't put too much weight into it immediately. And I think that's a common mistake. The same way someone could obsess about their body weight. They might say, okay, I know body weight is not the most important. Maybe body composition is more important. But you can obsess over the body composition value just as much, when really there is enough error involved in it that you should interpret it always with quite a bit of caution.
So with these two, so you mentioned different ones, or there's within the BIA, there's going to be different technologies as well too. Do they all measure just body fat percentage or muscle, or which would be lean body mass? Or does it just depend on which technology it is?
Yeah, that's a great question. They often will give the same metrics. I'll give a little bit of scientific background here just to help us understand this. So we know we have our body mass. We can assess our body mass very accurately. So even cheap scales are relatively good at getting a body mass or body weight estimate. Anything in the body composition realm is saying, okay, we no longer want to treat all the mass as the same. We don't care that this person weighs 160 pounds. We want to know how much of this is fat mass, how much of this is other things, and so on. So the most common way this is done is splitting all of body mass into two compartments, just two groups. So fat and everything else, which is called fat-free mass. That's what most of these devices are doing. So if they're giving you a body fat percentage, that's the fat mass it's estimating divided by your total body mass times 100. That would be your body fat percentage. So most of these are getting fat mass, and then fat-free mass is everything else. The problem is fat-free mass has a bunch of different things in it. And fat-free mass, really, when we're talking about it, and I won't get lost in the weeds here too much, but this is what we would call a molecular level concept. So this is just all the molecules in your body that are not fat. This is not saying specifically your muscles. And this is one thing people sometimes see. They'll see their maybe a fat-free mass from a scale like this and think, okay, that's my muscle specifically. But really, fat-free mass is all the water anywhere in your body, all the mineral anywhere in your body, all the protein anywhere in your body. This would include things like glycogen you have stored and so on. So it's literally all the molecules in your body that aren't fat. So this is one of the major sources of error of these types of devices is we have to make a lot of assumptions about people. So we have to assume everyone has fat-free mass that's pretty similar in terms of the amount of water it has, the amount of protein it has, and so on. The problem is that's not truly the case. So this is another wrinkle. Even if you had a pretty good device, if it's just splitting all of your body mass up into fat mass and fat-free mass, there's some additional error involved there because we do each have unique bodies that differ in some of these properties. So all that to say, most common devices will give you, if they're ever giving you a body fat percentage, then most likely they are using this two compartment model again, where they're splitting all your body mass into just fat and just fat-free. This is not directly measuring muscle mass. There will be some scales that have equations built in where they try to give you an estimate of skeletal muscle. Whether or not that's accurate at all really depends on how they developed the equation. There are some cases where companies develop really nice equations. So maybe they bring in a group of people, they actually assess their skeletal muscle mass, say with like magnetic resonance imaging or very nice medical imaging technique. And then they also assess them with their cheaper device. And they build some pretty good equations to equate the variables they get from those two methods. In other cases, it's just black box and someone sitting somewhere came up with this equation, just said, oh, on average, this is the relationship of fat-free mass to skeletal muscle. In some paper I found somewhere, we're just going to throw this equation into our device. So it's a little hard to know, but if you do see something saying this is actually your skeletal muscle, probably be a little bit skeptical because they're likely making some jumps from all these molecules in your body that they're estimating to like actual skeletal muscle. We're talking about these are like actual named skeletal muscles we could see and dissect off a person. Sorry, I know I meandered through some details there, but yeah, that's how I would think about that issue.
Yeah, so it sounds like the BIA stuff that you would get in a gym or at home, that's gonna just have the two compartment model. So it's going to just split it up between fat mass and fat-free mass. But obviously, as you said, fat-free mass, it's made up of a lot. It's multiple different things. It's not just muscle mass, which people commonly assume there with that. You do want to take that into consideration there. So you mentioned BIA. What would be some other ways to go about this? And again, this can be like, I know there's Dexa. I don't know if that is any different than BIA, but then also you mentioned some medical grade stuff. Would that be stuff that you guys would use in your research, or what does that look like?
Yes, so we do use some of those techniques that are considered medical or research grade, including Dexa. So if anyone's not familiar, Dexa stands for dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. This is a really nice technique. It's used clinically a lot for bone density screenings. There are some health clinics or kind of wellness clinics that will allow you to just pay to get a DEXA scan for body composition. Or again, if you're close to, say, a university or something that does research in this area, it's a pretty common technique. It is a very nice technique. Yeah, again, I consider it medical grade. As mentioned with bioimpedance and 3D scanning, it has different technology under the hood. It's a little bit more valid. It is an imaging technology. So in terms of how this works, if you haven't seen something like this before, we have a scanning table. We'll bring a participant in, lay them down on this table. Then they will be sitting there for about 7 minutes as x-rays are passed through their body. These are very low dose x-rays. So the amount of radiation you get is similar to a few hours of background radiation. So it's very low dose compared to most medical x-rays. But these x-rays are passed through this x-ray source underneath their body and collected by this scanning arm above them. And from that, we get an actual image of the body. So we can see the whole skeleton of each participant we scan. And essentially, the software is analyzing that image that's developed, looking at which pixels contain bone, which ones don't contain bone, and then the proportion of fat and lean in each of these areas. So, a really nice thing about this, since we have an actual image, we can look at all the different regions of the body. So, we could look at your lean, soft tissue, which would be all your tissue that's not fat or bone. We could look at that for the right arm versus the left arm. We could look at the legs versus the trunk and so on. So as a level of detail there, that's really nice that some of these other techniques don't have, in addition to the fact that it is a very good technique overall. It's not perfect, but it would be, yeah, again, considered medical or research grade. I might have gotten off track on answering your question.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a lag, so I didn't know if you were. I don't want to cut you off. Okay, cool. And so you guys use Dexa in your lab. Then, do you combine that with anything else, or just Dexa that you would use?
Yeah, fantastic question. I'm often asked if I could recommend like one individual method, what I would recommend for body composition assessment. So for that, I would typically answer DEXA. But as your question alluded to, there's even better things we can do, which is to take some of the data from DEXA and combine it with data from other methods. So hopefully our conversation up to this point has laid this background, but there are strengths and weaknesses of each technique. There's some techniques that are very good for something, but not the best to give you, say, a body fat percentage. So for example, if you were to come into our lab and we were trying to give you the best body composition assessment we would build something called a multi-compartment model. And this just means we're going to split your body into 3 or more compartments. So we're not just going to split it into fat mass and fat-free mass. We're going to start looking at some of those individual parts of fat-free mass, such as water and protein, individually. And the nice thing about this is it essentially allows individuals to be unique. So we know some individuals will, I don't want to say they have an average body, but from the chemical perspective, will have the assumed properties we think. They have the normal amount of water in their fat-free mass. They have the normal amount of protein and so on. But many individuals will deviate in those properties. So when we're doing a multi-compartment model, we can get an accurate estimate of body composition regardless of these unique aspects about an individual's body. So to do that, we would do several techniques. We would do a DEXA scan, and we would take bone mineral from that. We would get some estimate of body volume, so just the overall three-dimensional space the body's taking up. In our lab, we typically use BOD-POD for that, or air displacement plethysmography. If you've seen this, it looks like a little capsule. We're going to send you into space. We shut you into this little chamber. This is a more modern version of underwater weighing, which some people may have experience with, where you get dunked underwater and they're trying to check your weight underwater versus your weight on land. But both of those are providing a pretty good estimate of the volume of the body. So that's one thing we need. A very important component we need is the amount of water in the body. There are a few ways we can do this. The best way takes several hours. So we often, for practical purposes, will implement a slightly simpler way of doing this. But we can use a very nice bioimpedance technique to get a good estimate of body water. So bioimpedance, even though we can have these $30 at-home scales that aren't the most valid, we also have multi-$1,000 research devices that are much more advanced in terms of their actual components and also how they collect and analyze the data. So we have a form we use that will pass over 200 different frequencies of current into the body. And from all this data it receives, it can model the fluids in the body fairly accurately. So we would use that. So again, we have the bone content, the volume of the body, the water in the body, and then we would get a good accurate body mass estimate. And from those, we'd essentially plug those into an equation. And from there, we could give you a body fat percentage that has taken all these different factors into account for you individually, rather than just assuming you're quote unquote normal.
Chip, cool. And so I guess with all this information, probably the last half there, people are like, wait, so that's a lot that I need to do to get it accurately. So do you think it's important to track this? Like, obviously, and maybe we can hit on this from a Gen Pop or somebody that's just looking to improve their body composition, and then versus like in the research. So I guess with both of those, I would imagine probably in the research, it's a little bit more important, but for maybe somebody who's just Gen Pop, just trying to look better, do you think it's important to track this stuff? And what would be your reasons for that?
Yeah, I probably take a sort of middle of the road approach. I think, as we talked about a little bit earlier, I think some people can overemphasize numbers. And there might be some people who underemphasize numbers and don't track anything. To me, there are some parallels to things like whether you should track your nutritional intake. There are some individuals who by far make better progress when they're tracking. For them, it could even be lower stress because it takes the guesswork out of things. And they want that numerical feedback and they can handle it potentially without obsessing over it. The same thing applies to body composition tracking. There's some people who their body composition might trend in a direction they don't like unless they are staying on top of things like body mass, weekly body mass check-ins, checking circumferences. And this could be a very simple way you do this. You're tracking body mass, understanding that's not everything, but body mass, you're tracking some key circumferences, whether that's waist circumference or waist and hip, some of your appendages, particularly say if you're resistance training and trying to increase lean mass. If you're pairing something like waist circumference with some limb circumferences, you can start making some pretty good inferences looking at body mass in these simple circumference metrics. So that's a tangent, but that'd be a very easy way to track something without access to all this medical or research grade equipment. With all that said, I'd say there are absolutely people that can make great improvements in terms of performance, in terms of physique and so on without ever measuring anything. And there might be other feedback they're receiving. I recognize when I look in the mirror that I look better than I did when I started this program, or my clothes fit differently, or I feel more comfortable at the beach, whatever it is. They have some other type of feedback they're receiving that is giving them actionable information. Okay, this is working for me, or this is not working for me. So again, I take kind of a middle of the road approach. I certainly wouldn't say everyone needs to be tracking their body composition. And this is a lot of what I do. It's like the methods and the numbers and all that. But zooming back, there's some people who can never track body composition in their life and still have great health, great fitness, look great, perform great, and so on. There are other people where it's a tool for them. It is actually helpful to keep them on track or encourages them. They're like, yeah, I like to see that I decrease my waist circumference. That's consistent with what I'm trying to do from a diet and exercise perspective and so on. So that would be my view. Again, I try to view it holistically and not obsess over it, even though it is an area that I do find very fascinating.
You do research. So like for you, it's probably very important to be able to track these changes because that's like, if you're trying to, and maybe what you do helps other people like with their research as well too, because it just gives them a better idea of, hey, is this method gaining muscle? Is it things like that? So I would imagine that's probably where it's important from like a research side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're spot on. Part of the reason we do this, and we run studies, for example, I was talking about these at-home body fat scales. We ran a study like that here. So we have that all these expensive medical grade tests that I just described, and we do studies where we perform all those assessments on our participants, but we also perform some inexpensive at-home method, like an at-home body fat scale or a 3D scanning app. All these things I've mentioned, they're real examples of research we've done. And part of that is to translate. So to individuals, it's like, if you don't have access to this is how this cheaper device would perform. And then you're right, research, if we're trying to look at whether a certain type of exercise training or dietary supplementation is effective, we certainly need to be able to track these things to be able to help inform consumers, say, of those supplements. So you're absolutely spot on. For us, it's essential. But yeah, recognizing for the individual kind of fitness oriented consumers just in society, it could be used as a tool, certainly, but not essential for them.
And there's a couple things I want to hit on here with it too. And I'm sure like standardization, and we can talk about some potential errors, but real quick to go back to this. So I know you hit on how, again, these are the BIA stuff that you can have easy access to, like it's an estimate and then there's the equation or formula there with that. And so like how you mentioned already with that, there's already an error built in, but like how reliable are they? Like, I guess maybe could you hit on if you do get a certain number, what does that mean? Could it, what if it says you're 15%, does it mean this? Cause I always get a little confused in terms of, okay, is it off by, okay, you're 15%. So it's off by 2.5%. So could you be 17.5%? Could you be, what would that be? 12.5%?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or is it just off of how much it says you have in terms of like fat mass, things like that?
Yeah, great question. What you just described, I think everyone should think about body composition testing this way. This idea of some margin of error. For some devices, if someone's really interested, this is published. Again, for the consumer grade at home body fat scales, we published these metrics for a bunch of different devices we tested. So if you were wanting to, you could look up, and I have a kind of lay friendly article on my website if anyone's interested in that. But you can look up and see, okay, for this given device, if it has this error of 4%, then just like you said, if I got 15%, that means I could actually be as high as 19. I could actually be as low as 11. And for some people, did I say 5%, 4%? Anyways, point being the margin of error. That is a good way to interpret it. Even if you don't know the specific number, to think, okay, I see I'm 15%. Last week it said I was 14.7%. That is a very small error. Sorry, a very small change. It's very likely that falls within the error of this device, meaning I shouldn't be too confident that this was a real change. Of course, the larger the change is, the more confident you can be. All of this is predicated on something you mentioned a second ago, which is standardization. The quality of the data has to be high for you to even make any interpretations based on them. For bioimpedance particularly, it's very affected by things like your hydration level and prior exercise. But I would say across the board for methods, your best bet is to assess yourself fasted in the morning after voiding your bladder, minimal clothing or nude if you're in your own home, just as standardized as you can be. You've had this overnight period of fasting, resting, and so on. That helps. It's not perfect, but it helps normalize a lot of these random errors we see during the day. If someone just walks in off the street and we test them, there'll be a bunch of noise because everything they've done in the day can potentially influence these estimates. So if you are standardizing properly, that will go a long ways towards improving the quality of the data you're getting. But still, you should have this idea in your mind that there is some margin of error associated with this assessment. And for some people, the margin of error may be large enough that you're like, this margin of error is larger than the change I expect to see. So for that person, maybe it's not useful. If someone's sitting at 15% body fat and they're like, I want to be 13% body fat, but the device they have has 5% error, they might never be really confident that they're going from 15 to 13% body fat because it's a relatively small change. With all that said, I would say this doesn't mean you can't track anything, but just again, interpret it cautiously, holistically, think about other factors. If you know what your nutritional intake is, how your training is going, how you feel subjectively about body composition improvements, maybe some other metrics like some simple circumferences. If you're seeing all those kind of telling a story that makes sense, but then you see this weird value at your from your at home body fat scale, I would throw out that value and say, okay, I think I pulled a weird value here, or maybe the error on this device is too high because everything else I'm looking at seems to be aligning with improvements. But I think unfortunately, some people see that number and it derails them because they're like, I felt like everything was going right, but I got this number back that I don't like, and now I need to totally change up everything on my program.
Right, and really need to understand that there's that potential margin of error there, with it, and if it's a small change, it probably is going to fall within that potential margin of error, and then you hit on the standardization aspect of it. You mentioned fasted, first thing in the morning, stuff like that, and most people, when they're doing these, it's probably, especially if they go to the gym or they go to, like you said, a supplement store or something like that, and they have it, it's probably not under those conditions, so it's going to, alter that. So a couple things on that. You mentioned upwards of 5%, and you mentioned that it's also going to be dependent on the exact product and whatnot that you're going to use in the brand. What on average do you see in terms of that? Did you say it was like 2.5% on average, or what's that number there? Or what's the range? Is it a larger range than that? Or yeah.
Yeah, so there are a few factors here. Yeah, I just threw out a number. There are a few factors here. One is how reliable your device is, meaning, say you have an at home body fat scale. If you were to test yourself repeatedly, how consistent are those measurements? So that's one component. Normally, for those devices, the reliability is very high for immediately back to back tests. So if you got up in the morning, you were fasted, rested, and so on, you tested yourself, you stepped off, you tested yourself again. There might be some minor variation, but in most cases, if you're stepping on it correctly, you're running the device correctly, those values will be very similar. And we saw that in our research. All these devices had very high immediate test retest reliability. Again, you test once, you test the next time. However, the issue is if you're trying to track changes over time, even if you're standardizing appropriately, if you test yourself one morning and then some other morning, there will be miscellaneous factors in your body that are not quite the same. It could be related to what you ate the previous day, how much contents you still have in your GI tract. This would relate to things like body mass too, where you could see some changes up and down in body mass, even if everything seems consistent in what you're doing. It could be related to hydration and so on. So really, if you're trying to get a sense of this for yourself and you have, let's continue with that home body fat scale example, try standardizing overnight fast, you're rested and so on. Test yourself, say every morning for a week while you're keeping your exercise the same in general, your nutritional habits the same, and just see how much that value varies. If you look at those and you're like, okay, it's 17.0%, 17.2, 16.8, 17.3, and so on, you're like, oh, these are falling within about 0.5%. That's giving you a pretty good indication for you, this normal little bit of error you can expect over a very short period of time. Like day to day, we know we're not going to have a truly measurable change in body fat percentage. So that's one component. That's the reliability of the device. And again, the best way to do this is to compare several mornings, because what you actually want to do is compare one morning to another morning, say several months down the road, where it's okay, by now I might have actually had a real change in body fat. So there, what you'd want to see. So say again, from this week of assessments, you're like, okay, I think it's about 17% is my real value that this device is giving me. Then several months later, I'm going to do this again over the course of a week where I'm curious what my changes are, going to assess every morning. So say the average of those 5 mornings now was down at like 16% even. Even though that was a pretty small change, you can say, okay, these were pretty tightly clustered around 17. Now they're pretty tightly clustered around me as an individual consumer. I'd say, okay, I'm not going to put too much stock in it because it's still a small change, but it seems like things might be trending in the right direction. So that's a sort of answering the question, but an applied scenario. Now, the other aspect, which I don't think is as important for this conversation, is whether or not that 16 or 17% is actually true for you. Is it actually accurate? That would be where you come into my research lab, we do all these tests on you, and we might say the at-home body fat scale you have must underestimate you a little bit because with our best method, you're actually sitting at about 20%. However, does that really matter? If your purpose is tracking, I want to track a change, it's probably more informative to know how stable the results are you get with whichever method you're using, rather than knowing if that's the quote unquote real truth. So some related factors there. These are again, how precise the measurement is, how consistent those are versus is it actually your true value? There are some people who really want to know their true value, and that can be done again, like in research or medical settings. But if you're thinking about the application, understanding how precise your device is might actually be more useful for you.
Yeah, so that actually makes sense. So what you're saying there is most of them are like, as long as you standardize it, you get your number, and then over the long term, if you do see it trend down, like that's probably a good sign that you've dropped some body fat. If you've seen it go down over a long period of time, like again, like you said there, 17% down to 16. However, if that's your actual, what you're not going to know for sure is if that's your actual like body fat percentage, essentially because of the potential inaccuracies with it.
Yeah, exactly. So some of these large errors per device, it's saying it's maybe not great at telling someone's true body fat percentage. But to me, in terms of application, if you can track a change with it, that's really what most of us should be interested in. We shouldn't just be like, oh, I just want to be single digit body fat. I don't, some people care about the absolute number, but in reality, for most people, it's probably more helpful to have a device that can just help you monitor progress if that's something you're wanting to do.
Tracking that change is going to be most important versus at the end of the day, if you feel like you're looking good at 16%, what does it matter if you're 13 or 16 or whatever, as long as you feel like you like your body composition. So that kind of does answer that one question, because I've heard back and forth on this in terms of some people do say it's good at tracking long-term changes, but some people say it isn't. Is there anything that you can think of that would get people to think that way? Or maybe I just misunderstood that at some point.
No, I think you're right. What we just described, how I just described this, I don't think is how most people apply but the body fat measurements. One, even if someone has the awareness to standardize, others may not. People may, again, be just like testing at their gym, random times of day, testing in a supplement store, and so on. Even if they standardize, though, they might just be doing like one assessment at a time, and they might be doing it very frequently. So one assessment, 2 weeks later, they're doing assessment, and they're trying to interpret that change.
Okay.
That's potentially a problem. If, again, a way you could do this is multiple mornings a week and then averaging it, because that just some of those random biological variabilities in the body, those will be averaged out by taking multiple assessments over a short period of time. So again, if this was me, I had my at-home body fat scale, and I really wanted to know, so, okay, I'm about to make a dietary change, a fitness change. My goal is fat loss in the next 8 weeks. The week before I start that, I'd probably every morning, again, fasting, voiding bladder, not drinking fluid yet, as controlled as I can be, I would assess. So I do that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. At some point, it'd be too many, but say all 5 days, average all 5 of those, and you're like, okay, this is my starting number. Do the whole 8-week program. At the end, do that same thing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, average them and see. Now, if you do all that and it's still, okay, it was 17.5 to start and now it's like 17.1, you're dealing with a really small change you should be skeptical of. But the hope would be some of that random variability from one day to the next would be averaged out, and you would see, okay, I averaged 5 beginning and 5 at the end, and I saw a decrease of 1.5%. Again, I'll still be cautious, but I feel a little better about this. Unfortunately, what people do is they just do one assessment, say at each time. And you don't know if that's the one where you randomly measured a little too high, you randomly measured a little too low, or so on. So again, not the perfect way to do this, but one way you can get around this is multiple assessments at each kind of like time point you're considering, whether that's say before the diet and after the nutritional change or so on.
No, that makes a lot of sense. It sounds very similar to how I would recommend somebody take their body weight, right? We're not just taking
Yeah.
one weigh in, we're gonna do multiple and take that average from that because again, there's gonna be some variation from day to day there. And like we talked about,
Yes.
standardization is gonna be super key. Cool. So what about DEXA? Because a lot of people do have a lot of people have access to DEXAs. Is it gonna be the same? From my understanding, the error rate, margin of error on that's gonna be a little bit lower. Like how, but again, there's still gonna be some margin of error. So is that something that you would recommend people go and do every once in a while? Is there some pros and cons to that?
Yes, it lagged a little bit, but I'm fairly certain I got the question. So yes, even for a method like Dexa, that's a great method. We would have something if we were looking at the reliability between days. It might be something like 1%. We might have a technical error of the Dexa if we're looking at your body composition values one morning to the next morning of say 1%. And how we'd interpret that is if we tested you at one point in time and you came back and we tested you later, if your change was smaller than that technical error we saw of about a percent, we would essentially interpret it as possibly no change. If you were 16% even and we have a technical error of 1%, you come back 2 months later and you're 15.5%, we'd say, okay, technically it shows it went down by 0.5%. However, realize that our error from one day to the next can be 1%. So I would generally interpret that as no change. Yes. So even with the methods like that, you do have some error. And just let me know if there's part of your question I didn't answer, because again, I might have cut off a little bit of your question.
Yeah, no, I was just curious in terms of how reliable, because like you said, Dex is considered the gold standard, but even that, it sounds like is going to have some potential error built into it as well. So you do need to be careful with the results of what that gives you as well, if you do go and take it.
Yes, and I will just for as a Dexa, I think as an individual method is great. I would hesitate a little bit from calling it truly gold standard because it doesn't count for body water the same way those other more complicated models do. With that said, it's a great technique. If you have access to it, you can certainly utilize it. In terms of if it's actually useful for someone to utilize, a couple components there. One, if you have access to it, even at one point in time, it might be useful because it can give you relevant components we don't always think about, like bone density. That's something you will not get from any of these at-home tests, and it might be relevant to see your bone density. That's something that at one point in time, it's helpful to know because it can show where you are relative to where you should be, essentially. Now, for body composition, if you're like, I might have access to DEXA once a year, maybe it's useful for you, maybe it's not. It just depends on your timeline. If you're really interested in like year over year changes, then maybe. But if you're like, okay, within that year, I'm going through all these different like cycles in my program and this and that, and I really want more frequent feedback, then it may not be useful because you really don't want to compare across devices. You don't want to go get a DEXA and say, okay, my DEXA said I was 22% body fat starting out. Now I'm going to continue tracking with my at-home body fat scale. You certainly do not want to compare numbers across devices. So again, I would say DEXA is only useful if you can get it repeatedly for body composition, or if it's a single point in time, if you are just very curious about your absolute numbers at one point in time, or you want your bone density at one point in time. So again, it's all kind of context dependent on, is this a one-time deal? You have access to it. Is it like, no, whatever, I have a connection here. I can go pay $100 and get one done. And I'm willing to do that every 3 months. Again, just depends on those factors.
Yeah, absolutely. As with most stuff in fitness and nutrition, I feel like it's very context dependent on the utilization of things. So cool. I know you probably hit on this earlier, at least you did briefly. So what would you say against somebody who doesn't have access to DEXA, stuff like that? How would you go about measuring body fat and like muscle gain and stuff like that? Would you use a combination of like weight? I think you said measurements, stuff like that. How would you go about that with somebody, working with somebody or yourself if you didn't have access to the medical grade stuff?
Yes, similar to what you just said, it will be context dependent, but there are some methods that I think can be pretty good. Most of these will not be focused on actual body fat percent. We talked about earlier the idea of being maybe overly concerned with specific metrics. Again, there's generally not a perfect awareness, but some awareness of this in the fitness space. That's like, okay, body weight alone is not what I should look at. But again, we can make the same errors with body fat percentage, being like, oh, it's just body fat percentage I should look at. So I'd try to move away from there because lots of these simple methods would be best interpreted just looking at kind of the raw values. So, for example, circumferences, if you can track your waist and hip circumference, say upper arm circumference, upper thigh circumference, if you can track those well and also track your body mass, those can be really helpful things. And you don't need to plug these circumferences into a body fat calculator. But if you're looking at it and as you learn more about your body, some people are very aware of these things already. You may know it's okay when I start some caloric restriction, say I'm trying to lean out, I notice that my waist circumference tends to decrease. Say that's a site that tends to decrease early on for me. If you're tracking things, regardless of what body mass is showing, and you're seeing a waist circumference decrease, that's in, again, standardized conditions, morning fasted, and so on. That's certainly a positive sign. Or if you have a client who's relatively untrained and they're coming in and you might expect some recomposition where they're gaining some lean mass and losing fat mass, these circumferences could be useful. Maybe their body weight is staying stable, but you're seeing a decrease in waist circumference and like an increase in upper arm circumference. You're like, okay, they've added in resistance training for the upper body, which they were not doing before. It's reasonable that they might be gaining some actual muscle in their upper arms. However, they also report that they feel like their clothes are fitting better. They feel like they look leaner, and we're seeing this decreased waist circumference that supports that. So I do like circumferences. Again, another way to do this besides the flexible tape measure, there are several 3D scanning apps that you can run from your phone. These are continually improving, so they're getting to a point where they can be very precise. The nice thing about that is it's more fully automated. Someone could do this like alone privately rather than needing a partner to tape measure them and so on. Related to this, I think that would be a kind of easy, simple method for my own, like very frequent tracking. That's what I'll do at home is even though I have access to everything up here at the lab, we'll do some 3D scanning and do some body mass tracking with then less frequent assessments, say here in the laboratory. Related to that, some people enjoy using skin folds. This is another example where the default is, okay, take all these skin folds, plug it into a body fat prediction equation. But in reality, you can get a ton of good information just by looking at the actual skin fold thicknesses. So again, and it relates really directly to a physique goal for a lot of people. They may want to decrease subcutaneous fat on their abdomen. Measuring that subcutaneous thickness on your abdomen is directly looking at that. So without plugging it into an equation, you can be tracking the skin fold thicknesses if you wanted to at several sites. And that would be another relatively inexpensive, relatively easy thing you could do. Of course, it'd be important to have the same assessor doing this. Hopefully they would be relatively trained in this. But the same things we said earlier applies. As long as it's done the same way each time, it could be helpful in you tracking a change, even if it's not the perfect estimate of your, say, subcutaneous fat thickness. So those are a couple examples. Again, flexible tape measure or 3D scanning app, body mass, if desired, calipers. And then again, it varies for the person. Some people might say, I can just go off like standardized progress pictures and that works for me because that's really my goal is aesthetic and that's how I can tell best. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that either.
You mentioned 3D and there's apps for that. What does that, and you mentioned that the technology is getting better with that. What does that look at?
Okay.
You mentioned the 3D scanner and there's apps for that. What does that exactly measure? And I think you said that could be a replacement for the skin fold or the circumference measurements.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So the 3D scanning apps could be a potential replacement for something like the flexible tape measure. The advantage is they're very quick to conduct, and then it's essentially measured quite a few different sites on your body. These are in progress, so some apps are already pretty accurate. Some are improving and getting there. If you have access to someone who can use a flexible tape measure and can pull the same sites accurately, like measure the same sites accurately, there's still maybe some advantages to that. But the direction the 3D scanning phone apps are moving, it'll soon be that they're as accurate essentially as a trained like tailor, where it's easier to just take this scan and have all the circumferences on your body rather than spend 15 minutes having someone precisely measure these manually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because that's the biggest thing that keeps people from doing it, at least from a client standpoint, is just how it's tough to get it. It's tough to do it on your own. So that's usually what steers them away from it. So if you can have something that's super easy, like that would be awesome. I actually wasn't aware of that. So that's super cool. Awesome. So was there anything that we missed from a body composition standpoint or anything that you feel like maybe, we didn't hit on or anything like that that's important for the audience to know?
I don't think so, because I think we had those applications as we went. So again, I guess the last thing I'd reiterate is it'd be completely legitimate to never track your body composition if you feel like you're already making the progress you want. With that said, it can be useful for some people. If you are tracking, just remember there is a margin of error with every measurement. So interpret cautiously, standardize, and so on.
Awesome. And then last question before I let you go, as far as research in this area, since you're super into it, is there anything coming out or anything that you would like to see come out that you would like to explore maybe a little bit more?
Yeah, so a big, I've mentioned it several times. A big area of research we're looking at right now are the 3D scanning apps from phones. So traditionally, these 3D scanners might be in some fitness facilities or research labs or so on, but they were large, expensive, fairly non-portable. Of course, the availability of smartphones really makes it a huge advantage if you can have a technology you can run from your phone. I have a lot of optimism about the utility of the 3D scanning moving forward. That's probably one area I'm excited about now is just things moving towards mobile technologies where individual consumers could actually get high quality data without going to a research lab or something like that.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Dr. Tinsley, appreciate your time. A ton of great information in here on body composition. Last thing before I let you go, is there anywhere where you want to lead the audience to or where they can find out more about you?
Yeah, so I share about our research and some fitness related things, primarily on Instagram. So my handle there is just Grant_Tinsley_PhD. And then I have a personal website that has some more information again about our research lab and some of the work I conduct. It also has a few articles, including the one I mentioned about the at-home body fat scales, just summarizing our research from a more reader-friendly perspective. And that website is just granttinsley.com.
Awesome. Cool. Dr. Tinsley, appreciate your time and we'll chat with you next time.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.